HighBridge, a division of recorded books, presents Violence and the Sacred by René Girard, read by Peter Noble. Chapter 1. Sacrifice. In many rituals, the sacrificial act assumes two opposing aspects, appearing at times as a sacred obligation to be neglected at grave peril, at other times as a sort of criminal activity, entailing perils of equal gravity. To account for this dual aspect of ritual sacrifice, the legitimate and the illegitimate, the public and the all but covert, Henri Hubert and Marcel Mauss, in their Essay on the Nature and Function of Sacrifice, adduce the sacred character of the victim. Because the victim is sacred, it is criminal to kill him. But the victim is sacred only because he is to be killed. Here is a circular line of reasoning that at a somewhat later date would be dignified by the sonorous term ambivalence. Persuasive and authoritative as that term still appears, it has been so extraordinarily abused in our century that perhaps we may now recognize how little light it sheds on the subject of sacrifice. Certainly it provides no real explanation. When we speak of ambivalence, we are only pointing out a problem that remains to be solved. If sacrifice resembles criminal violence, we may say that there is, inversely, hardly any form of violence that cannot be described in terms of sacrifice. As Greek tragedy clearly reveals, it has often been observed that the tragic poets cast a glimmering veil of rhetoric over the sordid realities of life. True enough, but sacrifice and murder would not lend themselves to this game of reciprocal substitution if they were not in some way related. Although it is so obvious that it may hardly seem worth mentioning, where sacrifice is concerned, first appearances count for little, are quickly brushed aside, and should therefore receive special attention. Once one has made up one's mind that sacrifice is an institution essentially, if not entirely, symbolic, one can say anything whatsoever about it. It is a subject that lends itself to insubstantial theorizing. Sacrifice contains an element of mystery, and if the pieties of classical humanists lull our curiosity to sleep, the company of the ancient authors keeps it alert. The ancient mystery remains as impenetrable as ever. From the manner in which the moderns treat the subject of sacrifice, it would be hard to know whether distraction, detachment, or some sort of secret discretion shapes their thinking. There seems to be yet another mystery here. Why, for example, do we never explore the relationship between sacrifice and violence? Recent studies suggest that the physiology of violence varies little from one individual to another, even from one culture to another. According to Anthony Storr, nothing resembles an angry cat or man so much as another angry cat or man. If violence did indeed play a role in sacrifice, at least at one particular stage of the ritual, we would have a significant clue to the whole subject. Here would be a factor, to some extent, independent of those cultural variables that are often unknown to us, or only dimly known, or perhaps less familiar than we like to think. Once aroused, the urge to violence triggers certain physical changes that prepares men's bodies for battle. This set toward violence lingers on. It should not be regarded as a simple reflex that ceases with the removal of the initial stimulus. Storr remarks that it is more difficult to quell an impulse toward violence than to rouse it, especially within the normal framework of social behavior. Violence is frequently called irrational. It has its reasons, however, and can marshal some rather convincing ones when the need arises. Yet these reasons cannot be taken seriously, no matter how valid they may appear. Violence itself will discard them if the initial object remains persistently out of reach and continues to provoke hostility. When unappeased, violence seeks and always finds a surrogate victim. The creature that excited its fury is abruptly replaced by another, chosen only because it is vulnerable and close at hand. There are many indications that this tendency to seek out surrogate objects is not limited to human violence. Konrad Lorenz makes reference to a species of fish that, if deprived of its natural enemies, the male rivals with whom it habitually disputes territorial rights, turns its aggression against the members of its own family and destroys them. Joseph de Maistre discusses the choice of animal victims that display human characteristics, an attempt, as it were, to deceive the violent impulse. The sacrificial animals were always those most prized for their usefulness, the gentlest, most innocent creatures, whose habits and instincts brought them most closely into harmony with man. From the animal realm were chosen as victims those who were, if we might use the phrase, the most human in nature. Modern ethnology offers many examples of this sort of intuitive behavior. In some pastoral communities where sacrifice is practiced, the cattle are intimately associated with the daily life of the inhabitants. Two peoples of the Upper Nile, for example, the Nuers, observed by E. Evans Pritchard, and the Dinka, studied at a somewhat later date by Godfrey Lienhard, maintain a bovine society in their midst that parallels their own and is structured in the same fashion. The Nuer vocabulary is rich in words describing the ways of cattle and covering the economic and practical as well as the poetic and ritualistic aspects of these beasts. This wealth of expression makes possible a precise and finely nuanced relationship between the cattle on the one hand and the human community on the other. The animal's colour, the shape of their horns, their age, sex, and lineage are all duly noted and remembered, sometimes as far back as 5 generations. The cattle are thereby differentiated in such a way as to create a scale of values that approximates human distinctions and represents a virtual duplicate of human society. Among the names bestowed on each man is one that also belongs to the animal whose place in the herd is most similar to the place the man occupies in the tribe. The quarrels between various subgroups of the tribes frequently involve cattle. All fines and interest payments are computed in terms of head of cattle, and dowries are apportioned in herds. In fact, Evans Pritchard maintains that in order to understand the Nuer, one must chercher la vache, look to the cows. A sort of symbiosis, the term is also Evans Pritchard's, exists between this tribe and their cattle, offering an extreme and almost grotesque example of the closeness that characteristically prevails between pastoral peoples and their flocks. Fieldwork and subsequent theoretical speculation lead us back to the hypothesis of substitution as the basis for the practice of sacrifice. This notion pervades ancient literature on the subject, which may be one reason, in fact, why many modern theorists reject the concept out of hand, or give it only scant attention. Hubert and Mauss, for instance, view the idea with suspicion, undoubtedly because they feel that it introduces into the discussion religious and moral values that are incompatible with true scientific inquiry. And to be sure, Joseph de Maistre takes the view that the ritual victim is an innocent creature who pays a debt for the guilty party. I propose an hypothesis that does away with this moral distinction. As I see it, the relationship between the potential victim and the actual victim cannot be defined in terms of innocence or guilt. There is no question of expiation. Rather, society is seeking to deflect upon a relatively indifferent victim a sacrificable victim, the violence that would otherwise be vented on its own members, the people it most desires to protect. The qualities that lend violence its particular terror, its blind brutality, the fundamental absurdity of its manifestations, have a reverse side. With these qualities goes the strange propensity to seize upon surrogate victims, to actually conspire with the enemy, and at the right moment toss him a morsel that will serve to satisfy his raging hunger. The fairy tales of childhood in which the wolf, ogre, or dragon gobbles up a large stone in place of a small child could well be said to have a sacrificial cast. Violence is not to be denied, but it can be diverted to another object, something it can sink its teeth into. Such, perhaps, is one of the meanings of the story of Cain and Abel. The Bible offers us no background on the two brothers, except the bare fact that Cain is a tiller of the soil who gives the fruits of his labor to God, whereas Abel is a shepherd who regularly sacrifices the firstborn of his herds. One of the brothers kills the other, and the murderer is the one who does not have the violence outlet of animal sacrifice at his disposal. This difference between sacrificial and non-sacrificial cults determines, in effect, God's judgment in favor of Abel. To say that God accedes to Abel's sacrificial offerings but rejects the offerings of Cain is simply another way of saying, from the viewpoint of the divinity, that Cain is a murderer, whereas his brother is not. A frequent motif in the Old Testament, as well as in Greek myth, is that of brothers at odds with one another. Their fatal penchant for violence can only be diverted by the intervention of a third party, the sacrificial victim, or victims. Cain's jealousy of his brother is only another term for his one characteristic trait, his lack of a sacrificial outlet. According to Muslim tradition, God delivered to Abraham the ram previously sacrificed by Abel. This ram was to take the place of Abraham's son Isaac. Having already saved one human life, the same animal would now save another. What we have here is no mystical hocus-pocus, but an intuitive insight into the essential function of sacrifice, gleaned exclusively from the scant references in the Bible. Another familiar biblical scene takes on new meaning in the light of our theory of sacrificial substitution, and it can serve, in turn, to illuminate some aspects of the theory. The scene is that in which Jacob receives the blessing of his father Isaac. Isaac is an old man. He senses the approach of death and summons his eldest son, Esau, on whom he intends to bestow his final blessing. First, however, he instructs Esau to bring back some venison from the hunt, so as to make a savory meat. This request is overheard by the younger brother, Jacob, who hastens to report it to his mother, Rebekah. Rebekah takes 2 kids from the family flock, slaughters them, and prepares the savory meat dish, which Jacob, in the guise of his elder brother, then presents to his father. Isaac is blind. Nevertheless, Jacob fears he will be recognized, for he is a smooth man, while his brother Esau is a hairy man. My father peradventure will feel me, and I shall seem to him as a deceiver, and I shall bring a curse upon me, not a blessing. Rebekah has the idea of covering Jacob's hands and the back of his neck with the skins of the slaughtered goats, and when the old man runs his hands over his younger son, he is completely taken in by the imposture. Jacob receives the blessing that Isaac had intended for Esau. The kids serve in 2 different ways to dupe the father, or in other terms, to divert from the son the violence directed toward him. In order to receive his father's blessing rather than his curse, Jacob must present to Isaac the freshly slaughtered kids made into a savoury meat. Then the son must seek refuge, literally, in the skins of the sacrificed animals. The animals thus interpose themselves between father and son. They serve as a sort of insulation, preventing the direct contact that could lead only to violence. Two sorts of substitution are telescoped here, that of one brother for another, and that of an animal for a man. Only the first receives explicit recognition in the text. However, this first one serves as the screen upon which the shadow of the second is projected. Once we have focused attention on the sacrificial victim, the object originally singled out for violence fades from view. Sacrificial substitution implies a degree of misunderstanding. Its vitality as an institution depends on its ability to conceal the displacement upon which the rite is based. It must never lose sight entirely, however, of the original object, or cease to be aware of the act of transference from that object to the surrogate victim. Without that awareness, no substitution can take place, and the sacrifice loses all efficacy. The biblical passage just discussed meets both requirements. The narrative does not refer directly to the strange deception underlying the sacrificial substitution, nor does it allow this deception to pass entirely unnoticed. Rather, it mixes the act of substitution with another act of substitution, permitting us a fleeting, sidelong glimpse of the process. The narrative itself, then, might be said to partake of a sacrificial quality. It claims to reveal one act of substitution, while employing this first substitution to half-conceal another. There is reason to believe that the narrative touches upon the mythic origins of the sacrificial system. The figure of Jacob has long been linked with the devious character of sacrificial violence. In Greek culture, Odysseus plays a similar role. The story of Jacob's benediction can be compared to the episode of the Cyclops in the Odyssey, where a splendidly executed ruse enables the hero to escape the clutches of a monster. Odysseus and his shipmates are shut up in the Cyclops' cave. Every day the giant devours one of the crew. The survivors finally manage to blind their tormentor with a flaming stake. Mad with pain and anger, the Cyclops bars the entrance of the cave to prevent the men from escaping. However, he lets pass his flock of sheep, which go out daily to pasture. In a gesture reminiscent of the blind Isaac, the Cyclops runs his hands over the back of each sheep as it leaves the cave, to make sure that it carries no passenger. Odysseus, however, has outwitted his captor, and he rides to freedom by clinging to the thick wool on the underside of one of the rams. A comparison of the two scenes, one from Genesis and the other from the Odyssey, lends credence to the theory of their sacrificial origins. In each case, an animal intervenes at the crucial moment to prevent violence from attaining its designated victim. The two texts are mutually revealing. The Cyclops of the Odyssey underlines the fearful menace that hangs over the hero, and that remains obscure in the Genesis story, and the slaughter of the kids in Genesis, along with the offering of the savoury meat, clearly implies the sacrificial character of the flock, an aspect that might go unnoticed in the Odyssey. Sacrifice has often been described as an act of meditation between a sacrificer and a deity, because the very concept of a deity, much less a deity who receives blood sacrifices, has little reality in this day and age. The entire institution of sacrifice is relegated by most modern theorists to the realm of the imagination. The approach of Hubert and Mauss leads to the judgment of Claude Lévi-Strauss in La Pensée Sauvage. Because sacrificial rites have no basis in reality, we have every reason to label them meaningless. The attempt to link sacrifice to a non-existent deity brings to mind Paul Valéry's description of poetry as a purely solipsistic activity, practiced by the more able solely out of love for art, while the less able persist in the belief that they are actually communicating with someone. The two ancient narratives examined before make unmistakable reference to the act of sacrifice, but neither makes so much as a passing mention of a deity. If a god had intervened in either incident, its significance would have been diminished rather than increased, and the reader would have been led to conclude, in accordance with the beliefs common to late antiquity and to the modern world, that sacrifice has no real function in society. Divine intervention would have meant the elimination of the pervasive aura of dread, along with its firmly structured economy of violence. We would have then been thrown back upon a formalistic, critical approach that would in no way further our understanding. As we have seen, the sacrificial process requires a certain degree of misunderstanding. The celebrants do not and must not comprehend the true role of the sacrificial act. The theological basis of the sacrifice has a crucial role in fostering this misunderstanding. It is the God who supposedly demands the victims, he alone, in principle, who savours the smoke from the altars and requisitions the slaughtered flesh. It is to appease his anger that the killing goes on, that the victims multiply. Interpreters who think they question the primacy of the divine sufficiently by declaring the whole affair imaginary may well remain the prisoners of the theology they have not really analysed. The problem then becomes, how can a real institution be constructed on a purely illusory basis? It is not to be wondered at if the outer shell finally gives way, bringing down with it even the most solid aspects of the institution. Instead of rejecting the theological basis outright, qua abstraction, which is the same in effect as passively accepting it, let us expose its assumptions to a critical examination. Let us try to uncover the societal conflicts that the sacrificial act and its theological interpretations at once dissimulate and appease. We must break with the formalistic tradition of Hubert and Mauss. The interpretation of sacrifice as an act of violence inflicted on a surrogate victim has recently been advanced once again. Godfrey Lienhard, in Divinity and Experience, and Victor Turner, in a number of works, especially The Drums of Affliction, drawing from field work, portray sacrifice as practiced among the Dinka and the Ndembu as a deliberate act of collective substitution performed at the expense of the victim, and absorbing all the internal tensions, feuds, and rivalries pent up within the community. Sacrifice plays a very real role in these societies, and the problem of substitution concerns the entire community. The victim is not a substitute for some particularly endangered individual, nor is it offered up to some individual of particularly bloodthirsty temperament. Rather, it is a substitute for all the members of the community, offered up by the members themselves. The sacrifice serves to protect the entire community from its own violence. It prompts the entire community to choose victims outside itself. The elements of dissension scattered throughout the community are drawn to the person of the sacrificial victim and eliminated, at least temporarily, by its sacrifice. If we turn our attention from the theological superstructure of the act, that is, from an interpretive version of the event that is often accepted as the final statement on sacrifice, we quickly perceive yet another level of religious discourse, in theory subordinated to the theological dimension, but in reality quite independent of it. This has to do with the social function of the act. an aspect far more accessible to the modern mind. It is easy to ridicule a religion by concentrating on its more eccentric rites. Rites such as the sacrifices performed to induce rain or bring fine weather. There is in fact no object or endeavour in whose name a sacrifice cannot be made, especially when the social basis of the act has begun to blur. Nevertheless, there is a common denominator that determines the efficacy of all sacrifices, and that becomes increasingly apparent as the institution grows in vigour. This common denominator is internal violence. All the dissensions, rivalries, jealousies, and quarrels within the community that the sacrifices are designed to suppress. The purpose of the sacrifice is to restore harmony to the community, to reinforce the social fabric. Everything else derives from that. If once we take this fundamental approach to sacrifice, choosing the road that violence opens before us, we can see that there is no aspect of human existence foreign to the subject, not even material prosperity. When men no longer live in harmony with one another, the sun still shines, and the rain falls, to be sure, but the fields are less well tended, the harvests less abundant. The classic literature of China explicitly acknowledges the propitiatory function of sacrificial rites. Such practices pacify the country and make the people settled. It is through the sacrifices that the unity of the people is strengthened. Chu Yu, Book 2, Song 2. The Book of Rites affirms that sacrificial ceremonies, music, punishments, and laws have one and the same end, to unite society and establish order. In attempting to formulate the fundamental principles of sacrifice, without reference to the ritualistic framework in which the sacrifice takes place, we run the risk of appearing simplistic. Such an effort smacks strongly of psychologizing. Clearly it would be inexact to compare the sacrificial act to the spontaneous gesture of the man who kicks his dog because he dares not kick his wife or boss. However, there are Greek myths that are hardly more than colossal variants of such gestures. Such a one is the story of Ajax, furious at the leaders of the Greek army who refused to award him Achilles' weapons. Ajax slaughters the herd of sheep intended as provisions for the army. In his mad rage, he mistakes these gentle creatures for the warriors on whom he means to vent his rage. The slaughtered animals belong to a species traditionally utilized by the Greeks for sacrificial purposes, but because the massacre takes place outside the ritual framework, Ajax is taken for a madman. The myth is not, strictly speaking, about the sacrificial process, but it is certainly not irrelevant to it. The institution of sacrifice is based on effects analogous to those produced by Ajax's anger, but structured, channeled, and held in check by fixed laws. In the ritualistic societies most familiar to us, those of the Jews and of the Greeks of the classical age, the sacrificial victims are almost always animals. However, there are other societies in which human victims are substituted for the individuals who are threatened by violence. Even in 5th century Greece, the Athens of the great tragedians, human sacrifice had not, it seems, completely disappeared. The practice was perpetuated in the form of the pharmakos, maintained by the city at its own expense, and slaughtered at the appointed festivals, as well as at a moment of civic disaster. If examined closely for traces of human sacrifice, Greek tragedy offers some remarkable revelations. It is clear, for example, that the story of Medea parallels that of Ajax on the sacrificial level, although here we are dealing with human rather than with animal sacrifice. In Euripides's Medea, the principle of human substitution of one victim for another appears in its most savage form. Frightened by the intensity of Medea's rage against her faithless husband, Jason.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?